To a lot of people, myself included, Skyrim was one of the first games that really opened my eyes to how immersive open world games could be. It felt like a real place. It was imperfect, it was alive, and it was, because of that, unforgettable. Bethesda's worlds had that rare kind of magic, the kind where freedom mattered more than polish. Now, fast forward to today. Starfield is massive and technically ambitious, crafted by one of the most experienced studios in gaming. But for many players, it feels empty.
Some of Starfield's planets are meant to be empty by design, but that's not boring. When the astronauts went to the moon, there was nothing there. They certainly weren't bored. They weren't bored because humanity was advancing as a race, and we were doing shitloads of science there. We weren't walking into an empty box, you.
So welcome back to Stylized Station, and this is going to be the entire dramatic story of Bethesda, from a physicist side project in Maryland, which you probably didn't know about, to the most iconic RPG studio in the world, and the long, complicated road that brought it here. We're going to learn a lot of really cool, fun stuff today. So pull up a seat, get comfortable, and let's get into the story. In the mid-1980s, the quiet suburb of Bethesda, Maryland, became the unlikely cradle of an RPG empire. It was 1986 when MIT alum named Christopher Weaver founded a small studio that he named Bethesda Softworks, literally named after his hometown, so that's where the name of Bethesda came from. One of the interesting things about Weaver is that he wasn't an industry hotshot. In fact, he came from the world of media technology and academia. He was also a physicist who dealt with simulations. Now, at the time, he only had a few hires, but Weaver had a big vision. He wanted to put Bethesda on the map. Early on, the fledgling studio dabbled in all sorts of games, sports simulations, trivia titles, even licensed tie-ins, whatever would pay the bills and get their name out there. Because this was a very hard time for the industry. This was the game market crash. We don't have time to get into the full crash in this video, but I will make a video about it in the future because it's very interesting. Anyway, their very first release, called Gridiron, came out in 1986 and was a physics-based American football sim. And it was so ahead of its time that it directly inspired EA's John Madden football series. Bethesda's tech-heavy approach to simulating football collisions was revolutionary in 1986. Games were not doing this at the time, and Electronic Arts took notice. They ended up contracting Bethesda to create the inaugural Madden title. Now, that partnership ended as chaotically as a fourth quarter fumble with a legal dispute, and Bethesda ended up moving away from the Madden series. But it proved that Bethesda had tenacity and could duke it out with the big dogs. Fast forward a few years to the late 80s and the early 90s, Bethesda Softworks was still scrappy and opportunistic. They developed several games based on popular franchises, notably a series of Terminator action games.
Once he was programmed to destroy the future. Now his mission is to protect it.
In 1991, Bethesda's The Terminator game did something that few others dared at the time. It dropped players into an open world Los Angeles. Now keep in mind, this is the early 90s. There wasn't really RPGs, there wasn't open worlds, these didn't exist. This precursor to true open world RPGs hinted at the studio's grand ambitions. Bethesda was learning how to build big worlds, even if technology wasn't quite ready for their dreams. These early projects were moderately successful and earned the company a reputation for innovation mixed with some rough edges. But little did anyone suspect that a genre-defining saga was on the horizon, one born from a passion project within the studio that would soon end up consuming it completely. Every legend has an origin story, and for Bethesda, that was the Elder Scrolls. In the early 1990s, a handful of Bethesda designers, led by Julian LeFay and Ted Peterson, started building a fantasy game. Now, originally, it was just going to be about gladiator fights, like a simple game, medieval pit matches. Like that's it. That was the concept of the game. Can you imagine if just that version came out? It would be like no dragons, there's no dungeons, just like a medieval UFC sim. But as often happens at Bethesda, scope creep kicked in. They started adding side quests, towns, multiple dungeons, and suddenly this little tournament game was turning into something much bigger. By the time Elder Scrolls Arena launched in 1994, it wasn't a fighting game anymore. It was an open world RPG with a massive procedurally generated continent called Tamriel. Maybe you've heard of that world before. Now, for my old heads out there, if you've ever played Arena, do you remember how huge it felt? It was clunky, it was confusing, but at the time it was also like weirdly magical. You could go almost anywhere, even if you had no idea what you were doing. And somehow that chaos made it feel more alive than some other games that were coming out at the time. Now, it wasn't perfect, but it put Bethesda on the RPG map. Then came Daggerfall in 1996, and this is where things get a little bit wild. Daggerfall had one of the largest game worlds ever made. What seemed to be thousands of towns and dungeons spread across multiple provinces. And let that sink in. Let that sink in. 1996, right? No internet guides, no fast travel. It's just the map the size of an actual country. It also introduced stuff we now take for granted, joining guilds, factions, branching quest lines. Daggerfall laid the foundation for everything Bethesda would do over the next 2 decades. But it also broke. A lot. Buggerfall, as the fans lovingly called it. The game was glitchy, janky, unstable, and sometimes unplayable. For those who have played Daggerfall, did you ever get stuck in a wall or fall through the world or like somehow soft lock your quest? I mean, it happened to me all the time. But here's the thing. Players forgave it. Because underneath all of that chaos was something new. A world that felt simulated. NPCs had routines, and your decisions actually changed things. And for the mid-90s, this was absolutely mind-blowing. The risk paid off. Sales were strong, and fans were hooked. Bethesda had created something that felt alive. The Elder Scrolls was now a real franchise with lore, history, geography, and players who got completely lost in it. But success came with some consequences. You know, games that are this open-ended are actually really hard to make. They take time, they take money, a lot of experimentation. And Bethesda wasn't some massive studio. Yet, they were still running lean. The finances were always tight. So one bad game and they were in financial ruin. They poured everything into their games and hoped the next one would just keep the lights on. And then came a game called Redguard, a spin-off that did not do well. And suddenly, because of this, the whole operation was starting to look a little shaky. Have you ever worked on something that burned you out, that like stretched your budget, your team, your patience? That's where Bethesda was. They needed help. And in 1999, that help came. Sort of. A new corporate parent, a new structure, and eventually a new name would rise inside the company. The year 1999 marked a turning point behind the scenes. To secure more funding and future growth, Christopher Weaver teamed up with a Washington, D.C. media lawyer named Robert A. Altman to create a new parent company called ZeniMax Media. Altman was an attorney with big connections and, interestingly, the husband of Wonder Woman actress Linda Carter. Altman brought business acumen and investors to the table, while Weaver contributed the Bethesda IP and technical expertise. Under ZeniMax, Bethesda Softworks finally had the financial backing to pursue bigger, riskier projects. But that support came with a cost. It also meant a new hierarchy. Altman installed himself as the CEO and chairman of ZeniMax, and within a few years, Weaver, the founder, was quietly pushed out of day-to-day operations, and by 2002, he was gone entirely. He even filed a lawsuit over it. Imagine that. Imagine building something from scratch and then being forced to watch it grow from the outside. How would you feel seeing your vision handed off to someone else? It was a full-on changing of the guard. The physicist was pushed away and the lawyer took the wheel. Altman wasn't a game guy by any means, but he was extremely aggressive in the boardroom. He stacked the ZeniMax board with political and business heavyweights. He started plotting on how to grow Bethesda from an ambitious studio into something more. But if Altman was the muscle, the soul of Bethesda would still need to come from somewhere else. And right on cue, it did. A young designer named Todd Howard was quietly rising through the ranks.
I was the kid. I was writing games when I was, 12, whatever, and the other kids in the block would say, I'm going to play quarterback for the Cowboys, and I'd be like, I'm going to make video games.
Howard had joined Bethesda back in 1994, a diehard gamer who famously kept showing up at the doors of Bethesda until they hired him. By the early 2000s, Todd wasn't just another game designer, he was leading projects. And his obsession with immersive, dynamic worlds fit perfectly with the studio's DNA. His first big test was the Elder Scrolls Morrowind. After the wild sprawl and technical mess of Daggerfall, Bethesda had played it safe for a few years. But now they were ready to take another big swing. Learning from their past mistakes, Howard and his team didn't try to model the entire Empire of Tamriel. They focused on a single island of Wardenfell, one strange, handcrafted open world full of mushroom trees, insectoid cities, and aliened architecture. Morrowind launched in 2002 after years of grueling development, which also deserves its own video. And fortunately, it absolutely hit. Critics praised it, fans were obsessed, and it won Game of the Year awards and pulled Bethesda back from the edge of financial ruin. Morrowind was so special to me because it didn't feel like any fantasy game that came before it. You could do anything. You could rob merchants, you could kill essential characters, you could break the main quest entirely, and the game would just let you do it. Bethesda's design mantra, live another life in another world, fully came to life here. And something else important happened. Morrowind launched on the original Xbox.
Xbox, now $199. Think Xbox.com to win a Cadillac Escalade and up to 70 games. Rated E through T.
Console players got their first taste of a massive, immersive RPG, and they loved it. It was a revelation. This style of game didn't have to stay on the PC anymore. And behind the scenes, the team at Bethesda was now tight-knit and deeply passionate. In my research, I came across a few names that I want to shout out here. Designer Ken Rolston, artist Matt Carofano, and writer Emil Pagliarulo, who joined during Morrowind's expansions. And of course, Todd Howard at the helm. This was the game that made him a creative leader and eventually the face of the company. Now, internally, Morrowind changed everything. It proved that Bethesda's eccentric, simulation-heavy RPGs could find a mainstream audience. It also taught them a major lesson. Sometimes less is more. By narrowing the scope and handcrafting one memorable region, they achieved more than Daggerfall ever could procedurally. Bethesda Game Studios had officially found its groove, and up in the corporate suite, Robert Altman had to be watching with a smile. ZeniMax began expanding, eventually acquiring studios like ID Software, Arcane, and more. But Bethesda Game Studios was always the crown jewel. Altman's business strategy and Howard's creative leadership became a powerful, if unlikely, duo. The lawyer and the gamer. Now, flush with Morrowind's success, Bethesda wasted no time in plotting their next epic game. But before jumping into their next Elder Scrolls title, they made a very bold move. In 2004, they acquired the Fallout franchise. And at the time, it was a cult classic. It was beloved, but dormant. Todd Howard and Robert Altman saw the potential. And it's kind of wild to think about now, but like, what if they hadn't made that deal? Would we have ever gotten Fallout 3 or New Vegas or 76? Probably not, but that's for later, because in 2004 to 2005, the main focus was on something else. The Elder Scrolls 4, Oblivion.
For 65 years, I have ruled this empire.
Technology at the time was leaping forward fast. There was normal mapped 3D graphics, Havoc physics, and fully voiced NPCs. Bethesda wanted Oblivion to be a technical showpiece, not just for PC players, but for the new generation of consoles, specifically the Xbox 360. It was also a chance to go bigger, not just in size, but in audience. Todd Howard later admitted that Oblivion was designed to be a little more classical than Morrowind, more accessible, more traditional fantasy, less alien bug cities, and more familiar castles and forests. And it makes sense. If you want to make it a little more accessible to an audience, why not go with the tried and true medieval theme? And when Oblivion launched in 2006, it absolutely blew up. Here was a game where you escaped a sewer and immediately could run off in any direction and do whatever you want. You could go join the Dark Brotherhood. You could pick flowers. You could go close the Oblivion gates or punch mudcrabs for an hour. It didn't really matter what they did. The game never stopped you from doing all this crazy stuff because that was the point. Oblivion became a massive hit, transforming Bethesda from a cult favorite to a mainstream powerhouse. But once again, that success came with tension because Oblivion started to reveal a split in Bethesda's identity. On one hand, it had everything that fans loved, big stories, deep exploration, and incredible freedom. But on the other hand, longtime fans noticed things were changing. The mechanics were being simplified. The systems were being streamlined. The edges that made Morrowind so weird and fascinating were being sanded down. Bethesda was starting to walk a line between RPG depth and broader accessibility, and that tension between innovation and iteration, niche and mass appeal, would follow them for years to come. Still, Oblivion was far from safe. It introduced something called Radiant AI, a new system where NPCs could have their own routines. And sometimes this led to genius emergent moments, and other times it was just complete chaos. Ever watch an NPC try to make dinner and then end up on a murder spree? Welcome to Oblivion. And then, of course, how could we do this video without talking about the horse armor? In 2006, Bethesda sold a cosmetic horse armor DLC for $2.50. Players lost it. It became one of the first major DLC controversies. People mocked it for years. But here's the kicker. It was also the start of something big. Love it or hate it, Bethesda helped pioneer paid DLC in the modern era. And they were just getting started. Despite the drama, Oblivion's reception was overwhelmingly positive. It had even earned them a new in-house champion, Pete Hines. As Bethesda's head of PR and marketing, Hines became their chief defender, someone who'd spend years fighting for single-player games in a multiplayer-obsessed industry. Behind the scenes, Bethesda Game Studios was turning into an all-star team. Todd Howard, now executive producer, was the studio's showrunner and pitchman. By 2010, he was on stage at E3 delivering the kinds of presentations that fans were always excited about, and we lived for it. Emil Pagliarulo, the one who I mentioned earlier, who made a name for himself writing the Dark Brotherhood quests, emerged as the studio's storytelling ace. Later, he'd go on to write the Megaton bomb choice in Fallout 3, one of my favorite moments in gaming history. Meanwhile, Robert Altman stayed in the background, quietly building. He raised capital, he stacked ZeniMax's board with even more power players, he pushed for new IP deals, and in 2006 to 2007, Bethesda began publishing other studios' work. Because Bethesda wasn't just a little developer anymore, they were now becoming a publisher. And Altman's vision was clear. Make Bethesda a powerhouse with multiple franchises under its roof. And by 2008, that vision would come true in spectacular fashion, because the Fallout franchise that they'd acquired just a few years earlier was about to be reborn. Now, before Skyrim took over the world, Bethesda had one more world to rebuild. In 2008, they released Fallout 3, their first crack at reimagining the beloved post-apocalyptic RPG series. It was a huge risk. The original Fallout games were isometric, turn-based, and had a fiercely loyal fan base. And Bethesda threw that all out and rebuilt the series in first person using the same engine as Oblivion. Some fans were furious, but most players, they loved it. Fallout 3 became a massive hit, and it proved that Bethesda could do more than fantasy. They could build any world and still deliver freedom, weirdness, and unforgettable moments. Fallout 3 cemented Bethesda as the open world studio, and the success of Fallout 3 gave them the momentum and the confidence to chase their next, even more ambitious project.
In their tongue, he is Dovahkiin, Dragonborn.
On 11/11/11, Bethesda released the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and the gaming world has not been the same since. If any single title represents the zenith of Bethesda's influence and acclaim, it is definitely Skyrim. This game became a cultural phenomenon on a scale few RPGs ever achieve. The kind of game grandmothers knew by name, that was referenced on primetime TV shows, and that inspired memes. Like Fusro Da is still recognizable a decade later. In many ways, Skyrim was the perfect storm of Bethesda's design strengths. It offered a vast, rugged, Nordic-inspired province to explore, filled with dragons to slay, guilds to lead, and shouts of power to learn. It struck a sweet spot between accessibility and depth. A new player could pick it up and get lost in adventure, while hardcore fans could tinker with character builds and hunt for obscure lore. The game's open world design was so influential that even years later, other developers chased the Skyrim feel, that sense of freedom and discovery around every mountain. Remarkably, Skyrim sold over 30 million copies in its various re-releases, making it one of the best-selling RPGs ever. But behind Skyrim's triumph was the maturation of Bethesda's team. Todd Howard was still serving as creative director, and one could sense his guiding hand in every aspect of the game's polish and presentation. By now, Todd had become almost a rock star in the industry, winning a Lifetime Achievement Award and charming audiences with his confident, slightly cheeky showmanship. Now, he always peppered Skyrim's marketing with these really bold promises, but unlike some later missteps, which we're going to talk about soon, Skyrim delivered on most of them. Emil Pagliarulo, as the lead writer, made sure the world's storylines had emotional weight. The Dark Brotherhood assassination, The Dark Brotherhood assassination quest returned, the Civil War plot allowed players to shape the fate of Skyrim, and an innumerable number of smaller stories gave Skyrim an intimacy amidst the epic grander storyline that was going on. Now, the result wasn't bug-free. I mean, no Bethesda game is, but it was stable enough to let players sink hundreds of hours without game-breaking issues. And the modding scene quickly latched onto Skyrim as well, producing thousands of mods that extended the game's life indefinitely. Now, in all of my research on this video, perhaps the most emblematic of Skyrim's impact are the human stories that it generated. People who never played an RPG before became devoted Dragonborn. One couple, I remember this one story when Skyrim first came out about this one couple that even named their real life son Dovahkiin, which is like Dragonborn in the game's dragon language. And then Bethesda heard about it, and then they rewarded the couple with like free games for life. It was just a crazy time when that game was coming out. Bethesda was on top of the world, not just commercially and critically, but in mindshare. They were the masters of the open world RPG, a genre that they essentially brought into the mainstream. But it is important to note that by 2011, other studios were taking notice and aspiring to similar greatness. BioWare, the Canadian RPG studio famed for Mass Effect and Dragon Age, had shifted from classic RPGs to more cinematic narratives. And while their games were successful, like Dragon Age Inquisition even rivaled Skyrim for RPG of the Year in 2014, the winds of change were blowing at BioWare after their acquisition by EA. In Poland, a then smaller studio called CD Projekt Red was quietly working on The Witcher 3, learning lessons from Skyrim's expansive design and preparing to challenge Bethesda on the open world stage a few years later. But at the Skyrim moment, Bethesda was unrivaled. Todd Howard, humbly or slyly, acknowledged that Skyrim would be a very tough act to follow. He famously said, "We have no idea how long people will play Skyrim," as the game inexplicably tops Steam's charts for years post-launch. There was even a tongue-in-cheek campaign by Bethesda celebrating the virtues of single-player RPGs, #SavePlayer1 they called it, featuring Linda Carter as a counter to the industry's focus on multiplayer.
Today I'm here to talk to you about something serious. The need to save single-player gamers. Everyday gamers in search of a single-player experience are left behind.
And these sound like really cocky statements, but Bethesda had every reason to be confident. Now, perhaps too confident in hindsight, for it's often when you're flying highest that you forget how close the sun is. Because the next decade is going to end up testing Bethesda's limits and expose some cracks in the armor of the Dovahkiin. After Skyrim's apex, Bethesda took a longer than usual breather on new games. For a few years, they focused on supporting Skyrim, releasing expansions like Dawnguard and Dragonborn, and managing their growing publishing slate. ZeniMax acquisitions bore fruit. Arcane's Dishonored in 2012 was a hit, Machine Games rebooted Wolfenstein in 2014 with critical acclaim, and ID Software returned triumphantly with Doom in 2016 under the Bethesda banner. These successes reinforce what Robert Altman often emphasized. Bethesda Softworks was now a multi-studio family, not just one team. Still, the heart of the company remained Bethesda, and fans eagerly awaited their next project. That turned out to be Fallout 4, announced in 2015 with a relatively short hype cycle before its November release. I remember at the time, the anticipation was enormous. I remember at the time coming off of Skyrim, and when they announced the first game after that, I was so excited, and a lot of other people were too. Not surprisingly, Fallout 4 launched to blockbuster sales. It quickly became the fastest selling Fallout game ever, and one of the biggest releases of 2015. Set in the Commonwealth, which is post-apocalyptic Boston, it expanded on Bethesda's formula with improved gunplay, a base building system, and a more cinematic presentation for dialogue. Now, generally reviews were strong, but there was a perceptible shift in the tone from the critical community and some longtime fans. While acknowledging that Fallout 4 was a massive, fun adventure, critics pointed out that it didn't feel as fresh or groundbreaking as Bethesda's prior title. Its RPG elements were streamlined, the dialogue system became like a paraphrased response wheel, and many felt that it lost some nuance. Todd Howard later admitted that this new dialogue system didn't work as well as intended, and maybe you noticed it too. There was also the creeping sense that Bethesda's creation engine, an evolved form of the old Gamebryo engine, which we talked about earlier, was starting to show its age. Graphically, Fallout 4 was decent, but not cutting edge by any means. And more importantly, the familiar Bethesda bugs and stiff animations were still there. Meanwhile, the RPG landscape around Bethesda was evolving. Other games were pushing the bar higher, like Dragon Age Inquisition, and CD Projekt Red's Witcher 3 in particular took the world by storm, offering a massive open world with handcrafted quests and emotional storytelling in every nearly corner. It was a damn good game. It won Game of the Year in many places, often edging out Fallout 4, and people started wondering, has someone finally out Bethesda? But in 2015, Bethesda probably didn't feel too threatened. Fallout 4 was selling like hotcakes. The brand had never been bigger. Now, I know I've focused about people complaining about the lack of innovation, but the sales and player numbers were still sky high at the time. Bethesda even expanded the game studio, opening a Montreal satellite office in 2015 to support some growing projects. Internally, though, hints of fatigue and tension were beginning to emerge, because making giant open worlds is hard and extremely exhausting. Some longtime designers began leaving after Fallout 4. There were whispers, which were later confirmed by ex-devs, that innovation was getting harder under stricter scheduling. So that experimental magic that made Skyrim sing and soar and do so well was much harder to pull off now. The team was bigger. ZeniMax had more investors. The vibe was shifting from a band of dreamers to a corporate machine. Todd Howard and lead writer Emil and their leads had been working together for over a decade. Can you imagine how hard it is to keep pushing boundaries when you've already built some of the most iconic games ever? Still, Bethesda tried to shake things up. They launched Fallout 4 VR, Skyrim VR.
Alexa, play Skyrim.
You're level 57 and see a tall snowy mountain.
They even released Skyrim on Alexa, which turned out to be a real playable thing. These are mostly novelties, but they prove something. Bethesda's brands were strong enough to live on any platform. Yet their biggest experiment was still to come, and it wouldn't be greeted with applause. In June 2018, Todd Howard walked into Bethesda's E3 stage, as he had so many times, to unveil something new.
Fallout 76 is a prequel to all the other games, and it's our biggest one yet. It is 4 times the size of Fallout 4.
He spoke about publishing boundaries and how it just works, a phrase that would soon come back to haunt him in memes. The reveal was Fallout 76, a multiplayer, always online Fallout game. The first multiplayer game that Bethesda Game Studios had ever attempted. The concept, like most of their games, was bold. Take Fallout's world, but remove all human NPCs and let players inhabit the roles of vault dwellers rebuilding the Appalachia together. Howard bragged about revolutionary new technology and a map 4 times the size of Fallout 4. The pitch sounded intriguing, but some fans felt a pang of concern. Like multiplayer Bethesda, no NPCs, was this really what people wanted from Bethesda? I mean, for me, it wasn't. Still, the studio had earned a lot of goodwill over the years, and a lot of people were willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. But unfortunately, when Fallout 76 launched in November 2018, it arrived as a hobbled, glitchy shell of a game that satisfied almost no one, and the floodgates of backlash burst open. To paint the picture for people who never played it, Fallout 76 released with numerous technical issues, even by Bethesda standards. The game engine struggled mightily in the always online environment, leading to instability and bizarre bugs like immortal enemies or physics just like going crazy. And what was even worse, the no NPC design proved to be a huge mistake. Players wandered a vast West Virginia landscape populated only by audio logs and robots. There was little of the narrative richness or interaction that Fallout was loved for in the first place. The result was a world that felt empty and kind of pointless at launch. Many players hated the experience, and I know that's a strong word, but that's a word that came up a lot in my research, feeling that it betrayed what made a Bethesda game fun in the first place. As one Bethesda developer later put it, "We made a decision that was controversial, and it proved to be the incorrect decision." An almost comical understatement for what became a debacle. Indeed, Fallout 76 became a punching bag in gaming circles, a synonym for botched launch. Critic scores were absolutely abysmal, and fan anger was exacerbated by a series of PR blunders. The most infamous was the collector's edition canvas bag fiasco. Now, get this, Bethesda had promised a $200 Power Armor Edition collectible, promising a fancy canvas like duffel bag. When buyers opened the boxes, they found a cheap nylon bag instead, which is like a blatant downgrade. When confronted, Bethesda support initially gave a pretty dismissive reply that the canvas bag was quote unquote too expensive to make and that they weren't planning to do anything about it. So, of course, outrage freaking exploded. Like, what would you have done in that situation if you dropped $200 on something and got like a $5 knockoff? But eventually Bethesda apologized, blamed a contractor, and claimed that materials were unavailable. But it was soon discovered that canvas bags had actually been made for influencers. The optics were terrible, and to make things worse, Bethesda offered 500 atoms, which is like $5 of in-game currency as compensation. And the community understandably saw it as an insult. This fiasco became like a meme and a warning. This is not how to handle your fans. And there were other issues with this game. Nukes, crashing servers, personal data leaks, there were game-breaking bugs. So much actually happened that I don't have time to cover it in this video.
Look, I'm going to be real. Bethesda, it's okay to have flaws in your game. The fact that some of your planets are empty is boring to players. Just take the L and don't do it again.
And inside the studio, it must have been brutal. Bethesda veterans who had made like all of these beloved games were now fielding hate mail and online ridicule. Todd Howard went quiet, while PR leads like Pete Hines had to take the arrows to the knee. But over the next 2 years, the studio worked hard to fix things. They launched patch after patch. And in 2020, the Wastelanders update added human NPCs and real quest lines. And suddenly, Fallout 76 slowly started to feel a little more like Fallout again.
Take Fallout 76. A type of game we'd never done before. Had a lot of difficulties at launch, and we got a lot of well-deserved criticism. But the team kept working on it, and you kept playing it. And through all of that, something amazing has happened. It's thanks to all of you. This game has one of the best online communities we've ever seen.
But even so, the missteps kept coming. Bethesda tried launching a paid subscription called Fallout First, which was obviously widely mocked. Private servers were buggy, and people who paid for premium gear were harassed by the community. And in Bethesda's situation, what do you do? What do you do when your biggest fans become your harshest critics? That is something that pops up a lot in these videos. Sometimes the people that love your games the most, since they have the strongest emotions, they're the ones that are the harshest critics because they care about these games the most. It certainly was a rough few years for Bethesda. They went from revered RPG gods to an internet punchline. Fallout 76 did more than just hurting their brand. It also revealed deeper issues. Were they trying to follow trends instead of leading them? Had they become too rigid and too corporate? Was it pressure from ZeniMax to generate recurring revenue, or was it Todd Howard betting on something too different too soon? Maybe a mix of both, but to their credit, they didn't walk away from the game. By 2021, Fallout 76 had a stronger, more loyal community. But the damage was done. And just as Bethesda was trying to recover, another seismic shift was about to hit. The company's very ownership was about to unexpectedly change, and a new era was coming, and nobody knew what that would mean for the soul of Bethesda. September 1st, 2020, Microsoft drops an absolute bomb on the gaming industry. They announced they're acquiring ZeniMax Media, Bethesda's parent company, for a whopping $7.5 billion. That's $7.5 billion in cash. Now, just for context, BioWare was bought for under $1 billion and Mojang 2.5. So what made Bethesda worth 3 times that? Well, at this point, Fallout, Elder Scrolls, Doom, Wolfenstein, these were some of the most recognizable IPs in gaming. And to Microsoft, that meant one thing: leverage. But let me ask you, if you were a lifelong PlayStation fan and suddenly heard that your favorite RPGs might become Xbox exclusives, how would you feel? Because that's exactly what fans were worried about. Phil Spencer, the head of Xbox, tried to calm the waters. He said Bethesda would operate semi-independently, that existing commitments would be honored. But he also said that future games, they'd probably be Xbox and PC only. Now, behind the scenes for Bethesda developers, this was probably complicated. On one hand, deep pockets. No more stressing over loans from investors or making licensing deals just to keep the lights on. But on the other hand, new bosses. Phil Spencer might be gamer friendly, but he's still corporate. Still, many at Bethesda most likely welcomed the stability. But then, a few months later, after the deal was announced, tragedy struck. Robert Altman, the CEO of ZeniMax, passed away. He was 73 and had been quietly battling leukemia. Now, to most gamers, Altman was a name in a press release. But inside the company, he was the guy who personally handed out bonus checks, who fought to grow the company without it selling out. And yeah, he made some controversial moves, but people respected him. His wife, Linda Carter, yep, Wonder Woman, had voiced characters in Elder Scrolls and sang songs in Fallout 4, and she mourned him publicly, and the gaming world paused. It was the end of an era, and the baton passed quietly to James Leder, Bethesda's longtime president, Todd Howard, the ever-present creative lead, and Pete Hines, the voice of PR. But now, they all reported to Microsoft. Phil Spencer said the right things about creative freedom, about giving Bethesda room to breathe, and at first, it looked like he meant it. Bethesda stayed intact. Existing games like Elder Scrolls Online and Deathloop stayed on their original platforms. And then the shift happened. Game Pass. Overnight, the entire Bethesda back catalog hit Game Pass, and their future games became day one drops. And that's when the picture became clearer. Xbox wanted to own the next generation of RPGs. Elder Scrolls 6, Xbox exclusive, and no one's surprised. But here's what's interesting. Microsoft let Bethesda keep using their own tools, their own engine, their own way of making games. Compare that to what EA did with BioWare. They forced Frostbite on them, they crunched them, and then Anthem happened. And we all saw how that turned out. Again, that's probably going to be another video. So here's the question I want to throw out to you listeners. Is Bethesda safer now under Microsoft, or are they just slower to fall apart? Because on one hand, they've got time, resources, and support. But on the other hand, the magic isn't guaranteed. As Bethesda emerged under the Xbox banner, the studio's energy was largely dedicated to one gargantuan project, Starfield.
Todd Howard, everybody. Up for people, why did you want to make this game, Starfield? Why did you want to create a new world?
You know, I think like a lot of gamers out there, we have dreamt of a game where we look to the skies and we can blast off.
This was to be Bethesda Game Studios' first new IP in over 25 years. An entirely original universe, trading swords and dragons for spaceships and planets. Todd Howard had conceived of Starfield as far back as the mid-2000s, but technology and opportunity only aligned to start full development after Fallout 4. BGS Maryland, who's the main studio, took point on it, with the Austin and Montreal satellite teams assisting. And I can tell you, at the time, expectations were stratospheric. Fans jokingly said Starfield was Skyrim in space, and in many ways, that was the vibe that Bethesda itself had projected. They promised the hallmarks of their open games: huge open worlds, and in this case, galaxies, player freedom, rich quests, but now spread across a vast science fiction canvas with dozens of star systems. It was the kind of ambitious pitch that made Bethesda famous in the first place, but also the kind that made people kind of nervous. After all, we're coming off pretty fresh of the release of Cyberpunk, a studio with sky-high hype and a beloved pedigree, promising the world and then missing the mark. Starfield was actually delayed from 2022 all the way to September 2023, likely thanks to Microsoft's support and letting the team finish properly. They wanted this one to be good. They wanted this one to count. And when it finally launched, over 6 million people jumped in during the first week, which is Bethesda's most played launch ever. Now, overall, when I played this game, I was underwhelmed, and we'll get to that in a bit. But surprisingly, critics were mostly positive. Not Skyrim level raves, but solid scores across the board, at least the start. My main issue was with the exploration. There was 1,000 planets, which sounds impressive, but many of them felt procedural and less handcrafted than I'd hoped. Still, classic Bethesda style quest lines were still there, the faction stories, the main quest twist. These reminded people why they fell in love with Bethesda worlds in the first place. And most noticeably, it did have issues, but it was one of the least buggy Bethesda launches ever, and that is really saying something. That alone, in a way, looking back at it, felt like an arc completed. And technically, Starfield upgraded Bethesda's tools across the board. A new renderer, new scripting systems, and modders were thrilled. Finally, a proper foundation for the future. So, was it a win? Well, that depends. Starfield didn't become the next Skyrim, but in some ways, I guess it was pretty solid. And in a post Fallout 76 world, that alone was a massive statement. Bethesda still kind of had it, and they were once again playing the long game. Compared to rivals, it felt like the beginning of a redemption arc. BioWare, once Bethesda's closest competitor, was floundering. There was layoffs, failed projects, and hopes now pinned on one last Dragon Age. CD Projekt Red, after Cyberpunk's disastrous launch in 2020, had spent years rebuilding their image. And by 2023, Cyberpunk had its redemption moment as well, but it came at a cost, a lesson learned in public, just like Bethesda after 76. So now we look at the road ahead. Starfield is out. Fallout and Elder Scrolls are still alive. The Elder Scrolls 6 has been teased for years, and Todd Howard says it'll be once in a generation. But what generation will that be? And can they meet the expectations of a player base who is now raised on Breath of the Wild, Elden Ring, and other emergent sandbox games that raise the bar while Bethesda has been rebuilding? What will come next will be written by the next generation of developers, but they inherit one of the most iconic legacies in gaming. So here's the real question. After everything, after Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, 76, and Starfield, do you still believe in Bethesda's magic? Or has the golden age passed, leaving only nostalgia in its wake? Whatever the answer, the next Elder Scrolls will tell us. Bethesda stands out in that its identity has always been tied to its people as much as its games. Think of the personalities. Todd Howard, the wunderkind turned wise elder statesman who still gleams with boyish enthusiasm when talking about games. Robert Altman, the suave dealmaker who believed video games could sit at the table with senators and CEOs, not just kids in basements. Emil Pagliarulo, the dedicated writer reminding us that even in a game where you can do anything, a well-told story can still grab your heart. Or Christopher Weaver, the founder whose early vision of physics-driven gaming and go big attitude set the DNA of Bethesda that still persists today. These individuals, and many, many others in the trenches that I did not get a chance to mention, have left fingerprints on Bethesda's works. When you laugh at a weird voice line from a guard in Skyrim, or gasp at a moral dilemma in Fallout, or just stand atop a mountain in Starfield, watching the stars rise over an alien desert, you're feeling someone's creative passion echoing through the code. That's why Bethesda's saga was so compelling to me and why I felt so compelled to make this video. It's a collection of lives, stories, and risks mirrored in the worlds they've built. It's tempting to pinpoint a moment where it all went wrong, but in Bethesda's case, the story is one of cycles rather than a single fall from grace. They've had at least two truly WTF moments, the horse armor in 2006 and Fallout 76 in 2018, but they've also had many holy shit, this is amazing moments. Morrowind's comeback, Skyrim's dominance, and arguably Starfield's return to form. As of now, Bethesda is in a rebuilding and evolving phase. They are arguably more financially secure than ever, thanks to Microsoft, and yet they face a savvier audience and stiffer competition in the genre that they helped define. The next few years will be crucial. One can't finish a Bethesda story without acknowledging the community that's been integral to its success. The modding scene. From the earliest Elder Scrolls games, fans have modded Bethesda's worlds, fixing bugs, adding content, sometimes almost remaking the game entirely. Ambitious projects like Skywind or full-on expansion mods show how Bethesda's legacy lives on in the hands of fans. Bethesda's generally open embrace of mods, aside from a brief stumble with paid mod drama, created an ecosystem where their games could live on forever. I don't understand why many developers don't allow it, Todd Howard once said. That attitude won them massive goodwill. It was never just about letting players customize, it was about trusting the players, seeing them not as customers but as co-creators. Now, in my opinion, Bethesda's tale is far from over. Here's what history tells us. Bethesda will never be perfect, but they will always be interesting because they're human, and their games feel human too. So, what the fuck happened to Bethesda? Life happened, ambition happened, mistakes happened, victories happened. In short, a human story happened, and it's still unfolding. For fans of their worlds, that means there's always another vault to emerge from, another dragon to slay, another world to wander. Buggy, beautiful, and unmistakably Bethesda. Endure and survive, as the Fallout saying goes, and they've done both. And the best stories that are yet to come, maybe they're not over yet. Thank you so much for watching this video. This one was super fun to research and super fun to make, and a huge shout out to the people that watch every single video I make. I am really starting to love telling these stories, so let me know if there's another type of story that you want to hear. As always, thank you for watching Stylized Station. I will see you in the next video.